The Genius Trap, unraveling the dark truth behind the Laurie Show murder. What if everything you thought was real was just a trap? In a world where escape is impossible and the darkness closes in, one person must face the terrifying truth. Will they survive the twisted game or become part of the show forever? Stay with us till the shocking end, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The air in the room was thick, silent, cold. The shadows stretched long across the floor. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, sharp and deliberate. A faint smell of smoke lingered, mixed with the scent of something metallic, something familiar but unsettling. She looked around. The walls seemed to close in on her, narrowing with every breath. The television sat in the corner of the room, flickering, casting ghostly light across the room. It wasn't on, but it seemed alive, pulsing in the dim light. Suddenly a voice, low, grating. It came from behind her. She spun around, heart pounding. Nothing, just the empty room. But something was wrong. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, her fingers slick with sweat. The screen glowed faintly in the dark, displaying a single message. "Are you watching the show, Laurie?" Her breath caught in her throat. Laurie hadn't sent that message. Laurie was dead. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Her eyes flickered to the television again. A figure appeared on the screen. A man, his face distorted by shadows. His eyes gleamed with a terrible knowing. He whispered her name, the sound sending a chill through her. "I know you're still here." She froze. The door to the apartment creaked open. Her pulse raced. Who was it? Was it him? Was it the killer? Her breath caught. She glanced at the clock. 1:03 a.m. The time Laurie had been found dead. A gust of wind slammed the door shut, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The room remained shrouded in pitch blackness. Then she felt it, a hand on her shoulder, cold, unyielding. She didn't dare move. "I'm not done yet," a voice hissed in her ear. The lights flickered on, and there, standing before her, was the killer. Not just anyone. The man from the TV. His eyes gleamed with malicious joy. The truth hit her like a freight train. The murderer wasn't just watching her. He was inside her head. The show had always been a trap, and Laurie was only the beginning. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The figure smiled, her body froze. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick and suffocating. She struggled to breathe, but it felt like the very air was pushing against her chest. His smile grew wider, crueler. The man stepped closer, his breath cold on her skin. "I've been waiting," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. A sense of dread washed over her. The realization hit her like a punch. He wasn't just here. He was inside her life. His presence had always been there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. Her thoughts raced. How had he gotten so close? The answer was simple. He had been watching everything, every moment, every mistake. The truth was more terrifying than she could ever imagine. This wasn't just a murder case, it was a game where she was the prey. Her heart thudded loudly in her ears, drowning out everything around her. His hand reached for her throat, the coldness of his touch sending a shock through her. "I knew you'd come eventually," he said, his voice almost affectionate, like a teacher to a student. Her throat tightened, but she couldn't speak. She wanted to scream, but her body refused to obey. She tried to push him away, but his grip only tightened. A sudden flash of light, a memory, Laurie's face, that twisted smile. Laurie had known. She had been part of this game all along. Her best friend, her confidant. Had Laurie led her here? Had Laurie known the killer's plan? The man's grip loosened for just a moment, as if savoring her fear. Then, in that instant, she saw it. The door, just slightly ajar. Hope flickered. She couldn't think. She only acted. She broke free from his grasp. Her legs moved, but the room spun. She rushed toward the door, feeling the killer's eyes burning into her back. 1 step, 2 steps, closer. She yanked the door open with all her strength. The hallway was empty, but outside, the wind howled. It felt like the end of everything. She hesitated, her hand gripping the doorknob, fingers slick with sweat. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit, but it offered a sliver of escape. But the darkness behind her, the darkness that clung to her skin, was too strong. She stepped into the hallway, her breath shallow, each footstep echoing in the silent void. Her heart raced. Was he still behind her? The thought gnawed at her, relentless. She quickened her pace. The walls seemed to close in as she moved, the apartment now a distant memory, a nightmare she couldn't shake. A voice, distant but familiar, whispered her name. Laurie. It wasn't the killer's voice. It was Laurie's voice. Her stomach twisted in knots, and she stopped dead in her tracks. You were always meant to be here, the voice murmured from the shadows. Her breath caught. No, this couldn't be happening. Laurie was dead. She had seen her lifeless body. Yet that voice, it couldn't be. A cold wind gusted through the hallway, lifting her hair, sending shivers down her spine. The whisper turned into a low, mocking laugh. Asterisk, I told you it was a game, didn't I? Asterisk. Her body tensed, her mind racing. Laurie's face appeared in the flickering light at the end of the hall, but it wasn't the Laurie she knew. Her features were twisted, grotesque. A sickening mockery of a smile spread across her face. Asterisk, you should have known better. You always were too clever for your own good. Asterisk. Her hands shook. She turned to run but stumbled, her legs weak beneath her. The hallway stretched endlessly, every corner just as dark as the last. Something wasn't right. She looked back. There, in the distance, was the man from the TV, the killer. But now, his eyes were glowing with an unnatural light. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else. Something that existed in the shadows. Something that lived in the spaces between moments. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. Her pulse surged in her neck, pounding like a drum. Asterisk, you can't escape. None of us can. Asterisk. The killer's laugh echoed in the hallway, a twisted symphony of terror. She knew now. The truth had always been there. The show, the killings, they had all been part of something darker, something she hadn't been able to see until now. Her knees buckled. She was trapped. And the game was only just beginning. Her mind raced, but her body refused to obey. The walls felt like they were closing in, each step heavier than the last. Her breath came in sharp gasps, but she couldn't seem to draw enough air. She turned toward the only escape, the stairwell at the end of the hallway. She pushed herself forward, every step dragging her deeper into the dark. The killer's laughter echoed behind her, haunting, relentless. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't outrun him. She glanced back, half expecting to see his face right behind her, the one that had twisted Laurie's body into a grotesque smile. But he wasn't there. Instead, the hallway was empty. Too empty. A suffocating silence pressed against her ears. She stopped, half dazed. Was he playing with her? Was he waiting for her to make the wrong move? The door to the stairwell loomed ahead, but something stopped her. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. Laurie, or what was left of her. Laurie's broken form stood at the far end of the hall. Her skin was pale, her eyes empty and hollow, a dark stain running down her neck. Her lips trembled as though trying to speak, but no words came out. It's too late, the figure whispered in a voice that wasn't Laurie's at all. The whisper cut through her chest like a blade. She forced herself to take another step forward. She had to get out. She had to escape. The stairwell door was within reach, but it felt like the air itself was holding her back, pulling at her. She reached for the handle, her fingers cold and numb. The door was locked. Panic surged through her. She jerked on the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The killer's voice floated in the air, low and mocking. Asterisk, I told you you were never meant to leave. Asterisk. Her mind screamed in horror as the temperature around her dropped. A figure stepped out of the shadows in front of her, his face a mask of death. The killer smiling that same sickening grin. His hand reached for her, but before he could touch her, everything went black. A flash of bright light, then nothing. The last thing she heard was the sound of Laurie's voice, distorted and hollow, calling her name. Then silence. She woke to a suffocating darkness. Her head throbbed, painfully. She couldn't remember how long she'd been unconscious, or even where she was. The silence felt wrong, too thick, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Her body ached, bruised and cold, but she forced herself to sit up. The ground beneath her was hard and unforgiving, rough like concrete. She felt her hands against it, damp, gritty. Her heart pounded louder now, fear crawling up her throat. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Something scraped across the floor, a sound that sliced through the silence. A footstep? No. Closer now, the sound grew louder, heavier, like something or someone was moving toward her. Her breath caught. Her mind screamed, but her body couldn't react fast enough. A figure materialized in front of her, his presence too imposing, too real. The killer. He stood there in the blackness, watching her. His eyes gleamed with a sickly light, reflecting something far darker than the night around them. She could hear his breathing now, slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. You've been asleep for a while. His voice slithered through the air, thick with malice. He took a step closer, and she could feel the heat from his body, even though she couldn't see him clearly. Her pulse raced, panic bubbling up like a tidal wave. She scrambled back, her legs shaking beneath her. But the space was too small, too confining. The walls closed in. You thought you could escape, the killer continued, his voice low and taunting. Asterisk, you should have known better. Asterisk. His form shifted in the darkness, the shadows clinging to him like a cloak. She tried to steady her breath, to think, to move, but her mind was a blur, consumed by terror. Laurie isn't the only one who played the game, he whispered, each word like a jagged knife. Asterisk, you were always part of it. All along. Asterisk. Her blood ran cold. The truth, she hadn't just stumbled into this nightmare. She was a pawn in the killer's twisted design. The show had never been about Laurie. It had always been about her. A scream bubbled up from her chest, desperate, raw. But the killer raised his hand, silencing her. His cold fingers brushed her face, a touch that made her skin crawl. Don't worry, he murmured. Asterisk, this is where it gets interesting. Asterisk. The lights flickered, then blazed to life, blinding her for a moment. When her vision cleared, she found herself not in the darkness anymore, but in a room, a studio, a stage. She gasped as she took in the scene before her. There, in the center, was the same television set from her apartment. The camera was focused on her. The audience was silent, but she could feel their eyes on her, judging her every move. "Welcome to the show," the killer said, his voice now echoing in the space. And she realized then it wasn't just a game. It was a performance, and she was the star. The weight of the words hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her breath ragged, struggling to grasp what was happening. She was on a stage, a twisted stage. The lights were blinding, too bright, casting shadows that danced around her like phantoms. But the worst part was the audience. Though she couldn't see their faces, she could feel their eyes on her, cold and judgmental, watching her every move. "You're the star now," the killer said again, his voice a smooth, deadly whisper. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Her hands trembled, and she looked down, half expecting to see blood. But there was nothing. "Don't worry," he continued, the amusement in his voice almost palpable. Asterisk, "you won't be alone for long. They're all waiting for you." Asterisk. She turned around. Behind her, 2 doors stood open. The first door was dimly lit, and through the crack, she could make out a room, empty, cold, lifeless. The second door was different, bright, inviting even, but she knew better than to trust it. The killer's laughter echoed through the space, filling every corner, every crack. Her mind raced. She had to think. She had to get out. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. Asterisk, what's it going to be? Asterisk, he asked, stepping closer, his voice dripping with sadistic joy. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. Each one felt like a countdown. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her pulse hammered in her throat. The doors. She had to choose. But choosing felt like a death sentence either way. "The clock is ticking," he said, a dark gleam in his eyes. Asterisk, you'll have to decide. Are you ready for your final act? Asterisk. Her eyes darted between the 2 doors. The first cold, lifeless. The second, glowing with a sickly warmth. She had no choice. With a deep breath, she sprinted toward the second door, her feet pounding against the floor, every second feeling like it could be her last. She swung the door open, and what she saw on the other side made her stop dead in her tracks. Laurie, or someone who looked like Laurie, but it was the same twisted smile, the same empty eyes. The figure stepped forward, blocking her path. "You think you're running away," Laurie's voice came, hollow and distorted. Asterisk, but there's no escape from here. Asterisk. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. "You were always part of the show," the voice whispered. Asterisk, "and you'll never leave." Asterisk. The stage lights flickered once more, and the audience, they were waiting, the room around her, began to pulse, as though the walls themselves were breathing. Her heart raced, each beat louder than the last, thundering in her ears. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze pressing against her skin, suffocating her. The figure that looked like Laurie stepped closer, her face twisted into that horrifying grin. Asterisk, "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Asterisk, the voice echoed, but it wasn't Laurie's anymore. It was distorted, mocking. Asterisk, "We're all trapped here. Every single one of us. And now, it's your turn." Asterisk. The lights above her flickered again, and suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. A cold gust of air swept through, sending a shiver down her spine. She tried to move, but her legs felt like lead. The laughter, the killer's laughter, rang out in the darkness, louder this time, filling every corner of the room. It was a twisted symphony, a game she had never wanted to play. Then, the lights came back on. She was no longer alone. The stage was filled with shadowy figures, standing in rows, their faces blurred, their eyes unblinking. "They're all watching," the killer's voice whispered, coming from everywhere at once. His presence was suffocating, as if he were a part of the room, part of the air she was breathing. "You thought you could change the rules," he continued, asterisk, but the game was never about winning. It was about survival. Asterisk. She looked around, trying to find a way out, but the figures, the shadows, were closing in on her. Every movement felt like it was being watched, calculated. "You've always been a part of this, from the very beginning," the killer's voice growled. Her stomach twisted. Asterisk, Laurie was just the start. "You're the one who will finish it." Asterisk. Her mind screamed for answers. What did he mean? What had Laurie been a part of? And why was she the one left standing? She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Every corner of the room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows pressing in tighter, darker. Suddenly, a loud click sounded, and the figures surrounding her shifted. They moved closer. She backed up, her heart racing faster with each step. A door. She saw it. A way out. Her eyes locked on it, and she lunged toward it, her breath ragged, her chest tight with fear. But before she could reach it, a figure stepped in front of her, blocking her path. It was Laurie, or what was left of her. Her eyes empty, her body twisted and broken. She reached out, fingers cold, skeletal, grabbing hold of her wrist. "You're too late," the voice whispered, sounding like the very walls of the room were speaking. Asterisk, there is no escape from here. Asterisk. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and everything went black. The darkness swallowed her whole. No sound, no light, just the oppressive weight of nothingness pressing in from all sides. Her chest tightened, every breath a struggle, as though the air itself was resisting her attempts to fill her lungs. She reached out, her hands trembling in the void, trying to grasp anything, something, anything that might anchor her in this terrifying silence. But there was nothing. Her pulse thudded in her ears, louder and louder. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had come, a faint light flickered in the distance. It was soft at first, barely visible, but it grew, slowly, until it consumed the space around her. She blinked against the brightness, her vision adjusting. The familiar sound of an old camera whirring reached her ears, and then she saw it. The stage again, the set. It was exactly as it had been before. But something was wrong. The audience was no longer a shadow. They were real people, all staring at her. Every single one of them, hundreds, maybe thousands. They were all silent, watching her with eyes full of expectation, waiting for her to move, to act. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Welcome back," the killer's voice echoed in the space, smooth and taunting. She looked around, trying to find him, but he was nowhere in sight. His presence, however, filled every inch of the room. "The game never ends," he whispered, his voice a constant hum in the background. The lights overhead flickered again, casting the room in an eerie half-light. And then the screen. It buzzed to life, displaying a grainy, distorted image. Her face, her eyes, wide with terror, reflected back at her. She blinked, trying to look away, but her gaze was locked on the screen. "This is where it all ends," the killer's voice filled her ears. Asterisk, this is where you end. Asterisk. A low, ominous hum filled the air. The audience shifted, the sound of their rustling clothes like 1,000 whispers. They were waiting for her to act, waiting for her to choose. Her eyes darted around again. The exit doors. Were they still there? She saw them, at the far end of the stage, glowing with a faint light. But the closer she moved toward them, the further away they seemed to become. Each step felt like it was pulling her deeper into the game. "You can't escape me," the voice growled, now directly behind her. Asterisk, you belong to this show. You always have. Asterisk. The room spun. The audience's faces blurred, and she realized, with chilling clarity, there was no escape. Not for her. Not for anyone. She was trapped. The killer had always known. The show was never just about Laurie. It was about them all. And she was the last act. Her breath hitched in her throat, the truth sinking in like a cold, jagged stone. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the space shrinking, suffocating her. She moved towards the doors again, but they were too far. No matter how fast she ran, they always seemed out of reach. The laughter came again, loud, mocking, echoing in every corner. Asterisk, you've been part of this show from the very beginning. Asterisk. She turned, heart racing, to find him standing there. The killer. This time, his face was clearer, his smile even wider, stretching unnaturally across his face. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, savoring every second. Asterisk, did you think you were different? Asterisk, he asked, his voice silky smooth but dripping with venom. Asterisk, you were always going to be the star. Asterisk. Her legs shook as she stood frozen. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't obey. You thought you could control the narrative, the killer continued. Asterisk, but this story, this game, is mine. It always has been. Asterisk. Her chest tightened as the words sank in. She hadn't been in control. She had never been in control. Everything she had done, every move she had made, had been part of the plan. She was nothing more than a pawn in this twisted game. The killer's laugh echoed again, sending shivers through her body. You're not special, he sneered. Asterisk, you're just the final piece. The grand finale. Don't you see? Asterisk. She reached for something, anything to hold on to, but the cold, unyielding metal of the stage beneath her was all there was. No one gets out of here, he whispered, his voice a dark promise. Her mind raced. She had to do something, had to escape. Her eyes darted around the stage, searching for something, some way out, but the audience was still there, staring at her with their cold, unblinking eyes. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. A strange, unsettling thought flickered in her mind. The show was never meant to end. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about survival. You're the last one standing, the killer said, his voice low and almost affectionate now. Asterisk, and now you're going to finish the show. Asterisk. Her heart thudded in her chest. The lights overhead flickered once more, casting the room in a sickly, dim light. She moved without thinking toward the edge of the stage. There had to be something, some way out. You can't run, he said, his voice suddenly cold, sharp. She stopped in her tracks, her blood running cold. The air around her grew thick, oppressive. The killer was no longer just a figure on the stage. He was everywhere, in the shadows, in the silence, in the very air she breathed. This is your story, he whispered, his voice carrying across the room. Asterisk, and now it's time for the final act. Asterisk. The lights dimmed. The audience's eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time, she realized what the killer meant. She was never meant to escape. She was the show. The room began to spin. The lights flickered again, plunging her into darkness before blinding her with a burst of harsh, cold light. Her pulse pounded in her ears, each beat a deafening echo that drowned out everything else. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was frozen, trapped in the center of the stage, under the full weight of the audience's unblinking gaze. Her legs felt like they might buckle beneath her. The killer's voice slithered through the air again, smooth and venomous. Asterisk, there's no going back. You belong to this now. Asterisk. He stepped forward, his silhouette towering over her. She could feel his presence, a dark shadow pressing down on her chest. His fingers twitched, as if reaching for her, but he didn't touch her yet. Asterisk, you wanted the truth, didn't you? Asterisk, he whispered, his breath cold on her ear. Her body trembled as she nodded, barely able to speak. The truth. What truth? Asterisk, the truth is that you're never going to leave. Not now, not ever. Asterisk. Her throat tightened as the words sunk in, the finality of it crashing over her like a tidal wave. The killer's laughter rang out, deep and unnerving, vibrating through the air. Asterisk, you were always part of the game. Always. You were never meant to be saved. Asterisk. Her vision blurred. The audience's faces, twisted in grotesque smiles, seemed to melt and shift. She closed her eyes, but they were still there, watching, waiting. She tried to move, but her body was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "This is your story now," the killer said, his voice echoing with finality. Asterisk, you get to decide how it ends. Asterisk. The pressure in the room mounted, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the floor shaking beneath her feet. Her heart raced, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't think straight. There was no way out. The truth was too much to bear. She had become a part of the show, a part of his twisted game. "It's time," he said, his words a command. Suddenly, the room was filled with bright, blinding lights. The audience shifted, standing in unison, their gaze unwavering. And then she saw it. A single spotlight on the stage, shining down on her, as if to mark her as the final act. The killer stood in the shadows, his smile widening. "Go ahead," he taunted, his voice low, like a serpent's hiss. Asterisk, show them the grand finale. Make them proud. Asterisk. She looked around the stage, a blur of shadows, and finally, it dawned on her. There was no escape. She was the performance, and as the final act, she was the one who had to decide how it all ended. But there's only one way forward. "It's your time now," the killer whispered, his voice a cold caress. And with that, she took the first step into the unknown, her heart sinking. The show had already begun. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her toward the spotlight. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of the audience's gaze pressed down on her, suffocating her. Her chest tightened with the realization she had no control. Her mind screamed for a way out, for some escape, but it was gone. There was no escape. She reached the center of the stage. The spotlight burned hot on her skin, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. She could hear the soft hum of the camera, the subtle whir of lenses, capturing every movement. "Asterisk, do you feel it?" Asterisk, the killer's voice whispered, sharp and close. Asterisk, the tension, the anticipation. "You're the show now." Asterisk. Her breath hitched. She stood there, frozen in the center of the stage, with the world watching. Her mind raced. How had it come to this? She had been a part of the game from the start, whether she'd realized it or not. She was the prize, the centerpiece of the sick, twisted spectacle. And now, she was the final act. The audience's eyes, hundreds of eyes, were locked on her, waiting for her next move. They expected something that would make them remember her, make them talk about her. But she had nothing left. Her hands trembled at her sides. The killer was still watching from the shadows, his presence overwhelming, oppressive. "Asterisk, what's your decision?" Asterisk, he asked, his voice soft but dripping with malice. Her breath quickened. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse, vibrating with the energy of the room. "You don't have a choice," he said. Asterisk, you never did. You'll give them what they want. Asterisk. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She was trapped in the spotlight, the audience's expectant eyes burning into her soul. There was no going back. Every moment stretched on forever, a terrible weight pressing down on her chest. Her legs felt like they would buckle beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. She could hear her own heartbeat, faster now, almost deafening in the silence. "Time's running out," the killer's voice taunted. Asterisk, the show must go on. Asterisk. Her eyes darted around the stage, searching for anything that could break the cycle. But there was nothing but the audience, nothing but the game. The killer had been right. This was her story now, and she was the star. She could feel the walls closing in, the space tightening around her, and the floor felt as if it were shifting beneath her feet. There was no escape, no way out. The final act had begun. The air around her grew thicker, heavier, as though it were closing in on her. She fought the urge to scream, to run, to break free from the invisible chains that bound her to the stage. But she was trapped. She could feel it now, the weight of the audience, their gaze pressing on her like an invisible hand squeezing her chest. "You're going to give them what they came for," the killer's voice echoed again, impossibly close. Yet he remained out of sight. She wanted to shout back, to defy him, to defy all of this. But her voice was lost in the thick silence. "The grand finale," the voice whispered, almost lovingly. Asterisk the climax. "They'll never forget you." Asterisk. Her heart raced, the sound of it deafening in her ears. Her body trembled with the strain of standing still, of pretending she still had control, when everything had already slipped from her grasp. The spotlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the stage. And then a soft, almost imperceptible noise, a distant rustling, drew her attention. It was coming from the far side of the stage, beyond the rows of seats. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. The killer stepped out of the darkness, his figure more solid now, his face twisted into a sinister grin. His eyes glinted with cold amusement, as if watching her was the most thrilling part of this sickening game. "They've waited long enough," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. Asterisk, it's time for the final scene. Asterisk. He stepped closer. With each step, the room seemed to shrink, the walls inching in on her, as though they too were waiting for the inevitable end. "This is your moment," he said softly. Asterisk, make it count. Asterisk. Her mind screamed again. She couldn't do this. She couldn't be a part of it, but her body wouldn't respond. She was frozen, bound by an invisible force stronger than her will to fight. The audience's faces were no longer just watching. They were leaning forward now, eyes wide, hungry for what was to come. A low murmur of anticipation rippled through the room. The killer's voice slid into her ear. Asterisk, you were never meant to leave. You're the star of this show. You always have been. Asterisk. A shiver ran down her spine. He was right. She was the star, the final act, the climax, and there was no escaping the role she'd been forced into. The killer's hand reached out, and she flinched, but instead of touching her, he brushed his fingers across the stage floor. Asterisk, there's no going back now. Asterisk. A strange, chilling calm washed over her, as if the last shred of defiance had been smothered by the overwhelming weight of the moment. She stood at the center of the stage, unable to move, unable to think. And for the first time, she accepted the truth. This was her story, the story the killer had written. And now, she would play her part. The audience waited. The killer smiled. And the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness. A silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Her breath caught in her throat. She was alone in the blackness, surrounded by nothing but the weight of the moment. Her heart pounded, each beat like a countdown, the seconds stretching into eternity. Then, asterisk click star. The lights flickered back on, harsh and blinding. Her eyes stung, adjusting to the sudden brightness, and when her vision cleared, she was no longer on the stage. She was standing in a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick, damp, suffocating. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor beneath her creaked with every slight movement. The room felt suffocating. It was like a prison. She stumbled back, her mind racing. Asterisk, what is this? Where am I? Asterisk. But the killer's voice answered before she could ask. Asterisk, you thought you could escape, didn't you? Asterisk. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Her body tensed, the familiar chill crawling up her spine. The game never ends, the voice continued, now echoing from all directions. Asterisk, this is your new reality. There's no way out. Asterisk. The walls seemed to close in again, and she backed up, her breath quickening. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to make sense of it all. Hadn't she been on stage? Hadn't the show just ended? Her mind was spinning, every part of her screaming for answers. But they were slipping away faster than she could catch them. "You were always meant to be here," the voice whispered, smooth and dark, like honey laced with poison. Asterisk, this is your place now. You're just another part of the show, a show that will never end. Asterisk. The room around her seemed to pulse, the air growing heavier with each passing second. She needed to escape. She had to escape. Her eyes scanned the room. There had to be a way out. Her fingers brushed the walls, feeling the rough texture of the peeling paint. A window. She spotted it. A small, cracked window, high up on the wall, the faintest glimmer of light shining through the cracks. She made her way toward it, her pulse racing in her ears. Each step felt like a desperate gasp for freedom. But as she reached for the window, her hand passed through the air. It was as though the space around her was shifting. No, the room wasn't real. Nothing was real. "It's all a game," the voice said, its cold laughter filling the room. She dropped her hand, her chest tightening. There was no escape. "You're part of it now," the voice whispered, the words slithering through her mind. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air growing thick, suffocating. Asterisk, and you will never leave. Asterisk. She could hear it now, the sound of the audience. Their muffled murmurs, distant but growing louder. They were out there, waiting, watching. She could feel their eyes burning into her, and the cold realization settled in her chest like a weight. This was the final act, and she was the star. There was no turning back. The room felt like it was closing in around her, the walls pressing in tighter with each passing second. Her breaths grew shallow, the air thick and suffocating. "No," she whispered to herself. Asterisk, no, this can't be real. Asterisk. But the voice, that cold, twisted voice, echoed again. Asterisk, it's always been real, my dear. You just didn't see it until now. Asterisk. She stumbled backward, her hands searching for something, anything, to hold the rhythm of it overwhelming her senses, drowning out everything else. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Each step she took only seemed to draw her further into the nightmare. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were alive, moving just beyond her reach. Her eyes darted from one shadow to the next, but there was nothing but the suffocating silence. And then, asterisk click star, a soft sound, like the turning of a key, followed by the faint hum of machinery. The room began to shift, the walls groaning in protest, and she realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just the room that was changing, it was her. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she reached for the walls, but her fingers brushed only empty air. "You're part of the story now," the voice whispered again, colder this time. Asterisk, you can't escape it. Asterisk. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and the room started to tilt, slowly at first, but then with increasing speed. Her stomach churned, and she stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest piece of furniture to steady herself. But there was nothing to hold on to. The room was shifting, warping, twisting, and the sound grew louder, a deep mechanical whirring, like gears turning beneath the floor, making the walls vibrate with each passing second. Asterisk, this is where the show begins, my star. Asterisk, the voice was almost affectionate, the words dripping with venom. Asterisk, you'll never forget it. You'll never leave. Asterisk. Her breath caught in her throat as the walls finally stopped moving. The room was different now, darker. The window had disappeared, replaced by a thick, black fog that swirled just outside of her reach. She felt trapped, surrounded by shadows, suffocating in the heavy air. The audience was still there. She could feel their eyes on her, even though they were hidden in the darkness. She could hear them waiting. "They want to see the finale," the voice taunted. Asterisk, they want to see you break. Asterisk. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure of their gaze. Don't disappoint them, the voice hissed. Asterisk. Give them the ending they want. Asterisk. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her temples, trying to stop the dizzying whirl of thoughts. But it was too late. The walls creaked again, and the darkness around her seemed to pulse with life. There was nowhere to run, no way out. The final act had already begun, the pressure around her intensified, as if the very air was pushing in from all sides. Her breath became shallow, quick, the sensation of claustrophobia clawing at her chest. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, its smooth tone now laced with something darker. Asterisk, the show is yours now. Asterisk. She felt her legs give out beneath her, but there was nowhere to fall. The floor beneath her was solid, unyielding, as if it were part of the trap. Her fingers dug into the ground, her nails scraping against the cold, unforgiving surface. Asterisk, you belong to the game. Asterisk, the voice was closer now, almost right behind her. She spun around, heart racing, but there's no one there. Only the darkness pressing in. The audience's murmurs swelled, distant and echoing, as if they were closing in. They were waiting, watching. Her body trembled as the weight of it all crashed down on her. Don't disappoint them, the voice urged, now urgent. Asterisk. Give them what they want. The ending they deserve. Asterisk. She felt trapped, paralyzed by the crushing weight of the moment. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart, as if it were alive, sensing her fear. The walls felt like they were closing in again, the darkness pressing closer, narrowing her world to nothing but this single, terrible moment. "It's all a performance," the voice said, its tone almost tender now. Asterisk, but you're not just playing a role anymore. You are the show. Asterisk. Her chest tightened, her breath coming faster, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. The audience was still there, their eyes. She could feel their eyes on her. "You don't have a choice," the voice hissed. Asterisk, you can't run. You can't hide. The final act is here. Asterisk. Her heart was pounding in her chest, almost painfully loud in the silence. The room began to spin again, the shadows shifting, dancing around her. Her vision blurred as she staggered forward, her legs weak beneath her. The audience's murmurs became louder, more insistent, like a swarm of voices filling the room, demanding the end. She didn't know how much longer she could stand it, but as her fingers grasped at the air, desperate to find something solid to hold on to, she realized there was nothing, no escape, no safety. The show had already taken its toll. She had already become a part of it. And now, she was trapped in the final act, her vision blurred even more, the edges of the room fading into a haze of shifting shadows. She could no longer feel the ground beneath her feet, only a sickening weight that pressed her down, pulling her deeper into the void. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like it could be her last. The audience's murmurs were a chorus of anticipation, a single, unified sound that vibrated through her very bones. "They're waiting," the voice coiled around her thoughts. Asterisk, they're waiting for you to break, to finish the story. Asterisk. Her heart raced, pounding like a drum in her ears. She didn't know if she was standing or falling. Her body felt like it was both heavy and weightless at the same time. A strange, nauseating dizziness washed over her as the floor tilted once again. She tried to move, but her limbs were like lead, sluggish, unable to respond to her mind's frantic commands. "There's no turning back now," the voice whispered, smooth and cold, a shadow in the dark. Asterisk, the show is yours, whether you like it or not. Asterisk. Tears welled in her eyes, her body trembling with the helplessness that had overtaken her. There was no escape. The stage, the game, the audience, they were all part of her now. A grotesque, twisted reflection of what she had once known as reality. "You've always been part of this," the voice continued, its tone almost soothing now. Asterisk, from the very beginning. Asterisk, her breath caught. Asterisk, you think you're different? That you'll walk away. Asterisk, her legs buckled, and she crumpled to the ground, the floor cold against her skin. The shadows around her seemed to pull in closer, their tendrils wrapping around her, choking her, dragging her further into the abyss. Her mind screamed for release, for freedom, but there was nothing. "You can't escape yourself," the voice whispered a final, chilling truth. Asterisk, you can't escape the role you were always meant to play. Asterisk. Her body trembled, unable to stop the flood of emotions, fear, confusion, and the terrible, gnawing knowledge that she had been part of this from the start. The audience's whispers grew louder, a rising crescendo, until it was all-consuming. They were waiting for the final act, waiting for her to give them the ending. Her eyes snapped open. The walls were closing in. The shadows were everywhere. And the voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Asterisk, time's up. Asterisk. The darkness swallowed her whole. The silence that followed was deafening. Her heart thundered in her chest, a frantic, desperate beat against the crushing stillness. Her body remained frozen, swallowed by the all-encompassing blackness that had consumed her. The air was thick, stifling, suffocating. She tried to breathe, but it felt like the darkness was choking her, strangling every last breath. Then, slowly, the sound of a slow, mechanical hum broke through the silence. A dim, flickering light appeared in the distance. Weak at first, but growing brighter, more focused with every passing second. The ground beneath her began to shift again, but this time she couldn't tell if she was moving or if the room itself was changing. The voice, that chilling voice, was gone now, but the echo of its words lingered, haunting her every thought. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk. The light continued to grow, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. She felt an unnatural pull toward it, like some unseen force was guiding her, compelling her to move closer. Her limbs were still stiff, reluctant, but she forced herself to rise, her movements slow and jerky. Every part of her screamed to stay down, to resist, but the light had become an irresistible force, pulling her forward. Her steps were shaky, unsure, but she continued, moving toward the light. It felt like walking through a dream or a nightmare. The closer she got, the more the light revealed. The floor now felt solid beneath her feet, and she realized the air had changed. It was no longer suffocating, but strangely, eerily calm. Asterisk, you're almost there. Asterisk. The voice. It was back. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but her throat was dry, cracked with the weight of fear. The light had grown so bright now, it almost blinded her. She squinted, her eyes watering, but she couldn't stop moving. And then, in the blinding light, she saw it. A door. A single dark wooden door, standing in the center of the room, its edges glowing faintly. It was the only thing in the room that was real. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the impossible thought crossed her mind. Could it be the exit? Could this be the way out? But she didn't trust it. She couldn't trust anything. Still, her body moved, guided by some unknown force, until she was standing right before it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, her fingers hovering above it, uncertain. The audience's whispers filled the air again, distant but growing louder. The moment was building, charging with an electric tension that buzzed in her ears. Asterisk, it's time. Asterisk. The voice. This was it. Her heart pounded in her chest, threatening to burst free. With one last breath, she gripped the handle and pulled. The door creaked open with a low groan, as though it had been locked for years. begging for release. The sudden rush of cold air hit her face, sharp and biting, as though the door had led straight into a storm. She stepped forward, her eyes wide, but the world beyond the door was nothing. An endless expanse of blackness, stretching on, without end. Her breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. This wasn't freedom. This was more darkness. The door didn't lead to escape. It led to more of the same. She could feel the pull of the shadows behind her, the weight of the audience's gaze growing heavier, suffocating. "You can't leave," the voice whispered from the shadows, its tone thick with satisfaction. Asterisk, "You're meant for this. You always have been." Asterisk. Her hand gripped the door handle tighter, her knuckles white, as though holding on to the only thing that tethered her to reality. But there was nothing real here, nothing solid. She turned back, her heart hammering, and found herself looking once again at the blackened, twisted room. The floor beneath her felt unstable, as though it could collapse at any moment. The whispers of the audience were growing louder, louder than ever before, until they felt like a physical presence pressing against her skin. "You're nothing without us," the voice echoed. Asterisk, "You are ours now. Forever." Asterisk. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to break. She wouldn't. Her mind raced, desperate for any solution, any way out. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She had been wrong all along. There had never been an escape. "You think this is a game," the voice sneered. Asterisk, "But it's never been about winning. It's about survival." Asterisk. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but the world seemed to tilt again, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The room shifted, the walls cracked and splintered, and with each crack, the audience's voices grew louder, more insistent. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Asterisk, "You're the star, remember?" Asterisk, the voice was laughing now, mocking her, the sound echoing in the void. Asterisk, "And this is the finale." Asterisk. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her hands bracing against the ground. The cold, unforgiving floor. Her breath came in gasps, each one harder than the last. She could feel the weight of the world pressing in on her, and her mind felt like it was unraveling. There was no way out. No escape from the nightmare. "This is it," the voice whispered softly, almost lovingly. Asterisk, "This is where it ends. This is where you belong." Asterisk. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she accepted it. She was part of the show, forever. And there would never be an ending. The cold chill wrapped itself around her like a suffocating shroud. Her body was numb, her mind a blur, and yet she still felt the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, stealing her breath. The shadows moved closer. She could feel their presence now, thick and suffocating, crawling along the walls, crawling inside her. The whispers from the audience grew louder, the hum of their anticipation vibrating through her very bones. "It's time," the voice purred, a slow, cruel whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. Asterisk, "They've waited long enough." Asterisk. She opened her eyes, but nothing had changed. The same twisted room, the same oppressive darkness. And yet there was something new in the air, a sense of finality. The moment was no longer stretching out, no longer a battle against the inevitable. This was it. She was the star. She had always been the star. And the show, it would never end. "You belong to them now," the voice whispered. It was no longer mocking her, it was understanding. She could feel the truth settle in her chest, like a weight that had always been there, but she had never wanted to admit. She wasn't just part of the show. She was the show. And in this place, there was no escape. "The curtain falls," the voice continued, its tone strangely serene. Asterisk, the audience is waiting for you to finish the performance. Asterisk. Her hands trembled as she reached for the ground, as though trying to steady herself. But there was no steadying. There was only the silence that filled her mind, the hum of the audience's impatience, and the crushing, unrelenting darkness. Asterisk, it's your moment, dear. Asterisk. The last words echoed in her ears. A final reminder. The truth. The reality she had always tried to deny. There was no ending. No relief. She had become part of the show, and she would never be allowed to leave. And as the lights dimmed one final time, she understood. There was no escape. There never had been. The darkness around her began to fade, not into light, but into a muted, gray nothingness. It was as if the world itself had stopped, suspended in a moment where time had no meaning. She stood there, breathing heavily, her mind trying to grasp at the remnants of clarity that seemed to slip further away with each passing second. The whispers had quieted, the audience's demands vanishing into the ether. For the first time, there was nothing. No voice to haunt her, no shadows to chase her. Just the stillness. Her hands trembled as she reached up, brushing away the cold sweat on her forehead. She had come so far. She had survived the twists, the turns, the endless maze that had led her here. But now there was nothing to fight. The final curtain had fallen, but there was no applause, no fanfare. Just the quiet hum of the universe, suspended in a delicate balance, like the breath before a storm. She closed her eyes, her pulse steadying, the tension in her body slowly unwinding. She had been lost, yes, but in the end, it wasn't about escaping the game or running from the shadows. It was about accepting it, the truth she had fought so hard to deny. "You are the story," she whispered to herself, and as the last remnants of darkness ebbed away, she found peace. Not the kind of peace she had imagined in her dreams of escape, not the kind of peace she had once thought would set her free, but a quiet acceptance. She was part of the story now, and the story was hers. It had always been. And as the final breath of air left her lungs, she knew, this asterisk, was her ending. No more battles, no more running, just the silence that followed the storm, a silence that was finally and completely hers.